Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking on a really interesting and maybe quite controversial topic. It's one that definitely challenges some mainstream narratives and asks us, to really dig into how information shapes our view of global events. We've got just one source for this deep dive. It's an audio clip titled U.S. Copter Drops Supplies to ISIS.mp3. Now, this isn't your typical news piece. It's a dive into some pretty serious allegations. It raises some big questions about geopolitical moves and maybe even the origins of some modern conflicts. Our job today is to unpack the main claims in this recording, try to understand the arguments it's making, and look at the connections it draws. So get ready, because this is where it gets, quite thought-provoking.
It really is. This source, it offers a very specific viewpoint, doesn't it? It makes some controversial links and draws conclusions that are frankly provocative. So we'll focus on pulling out the explicit claims and looking at the evidence, or maybe the lack of evidence, presented within the source itself, just to help you navigate these kinds of complex stories without, feeling lost in it all.
Okay, let's jump straight into that main allegation then. The source kicks off with a direct accusation. It mentions an Iraqi media report citing a video from the Hizbullah brigades based in Iraq. They're described as a local resistance group. And this video, supposedly recorded back on February 9th, allegedly shows a U.S. Chinook helicopter.
The Chinook, right.
Yeah, flying pretty low in the Al-Bar area that's south of Fallujah, and it's apparently dropping 2 boxes.
Boxes full of weapons, the source claims, for ISIL militants on the ground.
Exactly. And importantly, the source points out this wasn't supposedly a one-off thing. It brings up earlier reports, too, about U.S. helicopters landing in Fallujah,
Which it identifies as, a key base for militants in Iraq, using the term Qidi militants. Fallujah has certainly been a hotspot historically.
Right.
And what's really interesting is how these specific reports, especially the video, seem to immediately spark a lot of talk. The source says it pushed Iraqi lawmakers to actually call for an official investigation. And that really highlights something, doesn't it? How one alleged incident can just, boom, blow up into wider political debate, especially when it touches on sensitive foreign policy nerves in such a tense region.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's from that specific controversy, that alleged incident, that the source then pivots to something much, much bigger. It starts questioning the very origin of ISIS itself, asking whether ISIS or ISIL, or even it mentions the Israeli Strategic Secret Intelligence Service.
That's quite a list of acronyms and potential interpretations right there.
It is, asking if it was actually created by U.S. agencies.
Oh.
That explicitly throws out names like the CIA, the Pentagon, the NSA,
Right.
or maybe even Mossad, from Israel.
Okay, so that's a huge claim. And the immediate question is why? Why would the source make such an assertion? Who is saying this? Well, the audio directly credits this accusation to the president of Sudan and also the head of Hezbollah,
Right.
stating that they believe ISIS is, and this is a quote, just a creation of the State Department.
Just like Al-Qaeda, it adds.
Exactly. It draws that direct parallel. And to kind of back this up, or at least add weight to the skepticism, the source brings up Osama bin Laden's death. It questions, where were the photos? The DNA proof. Not even a tweet pic, it says.
Despite the context of...
Well, yeah, despite the $1 trillion+ and thousands of American lives spent post-Bush based on what the source calls false pretenses, it specifically mentions weapons of mass destruction, calling that total bullshit.
Right, so the implication is pretty clear.
Yeah, the logic presented is, if they lied about WMDs, maybe they're lying about ISIS's origins too. It's connecting those dots of perceived deception.
And this is where the source really links it all to broader U.S. foreign policy strategy. It frames ISIS as Obama's equivalent of Bush's Al-Qaeda and WMDs.
Meaning
the argument goes that ISIS exists mainly to justify more war in the Middle East, a continuation.
Okay, but how do you get public support for that, especially after years of conflict potential?
Well, the source has a very specific and frankly pretty grim answer for that. It says it's done through the graphic depiction of violence in the mainstream media.
Ah, the media angle.
Right.
It recounts the beheading of Jim Foley, saying that happened when most Americans apparently didn't want more war, they wanted withdrawal. But then, the source claims, came the escalation, the constant amplification of ISIS atrocities. It lists things like multiple beheadings of Coptic Christians on a beach in Libya,
Right.
women being gang raped, kids being slaughtered, people thrown off buildings.
Horrific stuff.
Truly horrific. It even mentions reports of organ harvesting for the black market. Just absolutely brutal imagery.
And the effect of all this, according to the source,
It was a profound shift in public opinion. It cites a recent CNN and CNBC poll, recent at the time of the recording, presumably suggesting Americans then overwhelmingly support intervention.
So the narrative presented is that this graphic content was essentially a tool.
Exactly. A tool used, the source argues, to justify not just the ongoing wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also things like drone strikes in Syria, and even pushing towards a wider conflict, potentially involving Russia, by pushing Putin into a corner, as the source puts it. It's a very critical take on media influence.
Okay, so building on that idea of ISIS as potentially manufactured, the source then suggests the U.S. is actively using ISIS, dropping them guns, weapons, funding them, and so on,
For what purpose?
to fulfill its own destabilization effort, particularly in places like Syria.
Right. The source claims this ties into a long-running U.S. goal to oust Assad, something they've wanted for some time now.
It even goes so far as to allege the engineering of a false flag incident, the chemical attack in Ghouta in 2013.
Which was initially widely blamed on Assad's forces, correct?
Yes, but the source claims it was more than likely the rebels on the ground, who it calls the terrorists the United States had been arming.
So flipping the script entirely on that incident,
Pretty much. And connecting this back to the bigger picture, the source keeps hitting this note.
that it all just conveniently runs right into the laps of politicians who want war.
Exactly. That's the argument. It insists that no real shred of evidence is provided for the official narrative about ISIS, and that if you even question ISIS and their legitimacy, the government might label you a terrorist sympathizer.
Which it describes as classic propaganda, the idea that you first demonize the enemies so they're easier to kill, and then you use it to serve your own agenda. It draws this quite controversial historical parallel.
To Pearl Harbor.
Yes. Claiming the U.S. actually helped to promote the attack on Pearl Harbor by putting an embargo on Japan beforehand. Why? Because, the source argues, it justified getting the U.S. into World War II.
And the assertion is,
We're doing the same thing now. We're just blaming ISIS. That's the direct claim made in the audio. It's a very stark comparison.
wow, okay. The source also seems to take aim at America's image, its self-perception.
It does. It uses this imagery of the U.S. always being the good guy.
Wearing a little angel cap and angel wings, yeah, like the choir boy of the world.
While everyone else is demonized, Putin is the next Hitler, ISIS is the devil.
And the suggestion is that the U.S. government actively cultivates this image.
Yes, precisely to justify its actions, especially these ongoing wars. It's presented as a deliberate manipulation of perception.
Challenging that whole moral high ground idea.
Absolutely. And this whole narrative, this entire critique, it kind of circles back and culminates in the source, basically saying, look, President Sudan's probably right, and the leader of Hezbollah's probably right. Meaning the core assertion, the final takeaway presented, is that the real terrorism, the responsible party for the chaos in the Middle East, is probably coming from the State Department, probably coming from the United States federal government.
All to serve an agenda.
To serve our own agenda, the source says, to push a narrative of war, a continuation of these wars. That's the bottom line, according to this audio. And it ends by highlighting the sheer power of those violent images we discussed, saying it's almost impossible to argue against the emotional force of beheadings, the raping and pillaging, the murder of children.
Calling it a perfect tool.
A perfect tool, yes, and essentially psychological warfare. Engineered, it claims, to convince the public that war isn't just an option, but a necessity, a moral duty even.
Right. So after unpacking all of that, what does this mean for you, our listener, trying to make sense of these complex issues?
Well, this deep dive really gives you a prime example of a, let's say, alternative and highly critical viewpoint on conflict and public opinion. It forces us, I think, to think about how different narratives get built, what evidence is used or maybe not used, and how these stories ultimately shape how we understand what's happening in the world.
You've definitely heard a very specific, very controversial set of claims today, linking current events back to history, questioning motives of powerful players. The source is really asking us to look critically at the information we get from governments, from media.
Suggesting that even our basic understanding of who the enemy is might be, well, carefully managed.
Yeah. This deep dive has definitely presented a challenging perspective for you to think about, and maybe it leaves you with this question to sort of mull over. In this age where we're just flooded with information, how do we as individuals trying to stay informed? How do we really tell the difference between a genuine threat and one that might be, as this source suggests, pretty forcefully, strategically amplified or maybe even created to push a specific agenda?
That's the critical thinking challenge, isn't it? Something to definitely keep in mind as you consume news and analysis.